Welcome to World Affairs Today, brought to you by the World Affairs Council, Washington, D.C., a leading forum for global education and international affairs.
Good evening. Welcome to the World Affairs Council's Foreign Policy Discussion and Debate. I'm Heidi Shoup, President of the World Affairs Council, and it's my pleasure to welcome you here this evening. Thank you for joining us as we take time to note the 10th anniversary of the U.S. invasion of Iraq. Recently, there have been a number of articles and numerous think tank events around town focused on one aspect or another of the war and its downstream consequences, in human cost, in financial terms, and in terms of its effect on U.S. standing. The World Affairs Council convenes this panel to discuss the long-term impact of the war on U.S. foreign policy and its effects on the future of U.S. military planning. Was it worth it? We are joined this evening by Dr. James Carafano and Dr. Joseph Collins, and they will be introduced by our moderator, Beverly Kirk. It is my pleasure to introduce Bev. She is CEO of Bevkirk International and Director of the Ideas Lab at the Center for Strategic and International Studies. Previously, her career was in television broadcasting, and she anchored several news programs for News Channel 8 and served as a correspondent for NPR and PBS stations and for the NBC News Channel, the affiliate of NBC News. Bev is also a member of the Board of Directors of the World Affairs Council, and we much appreciate having her here tonight as moderator. Please join me in welcoming our panel. Bev?
Thank you very much. And thank you all for being here this evening. Let me start by introducing our panelists here. The question, as Heidi mentioned, is, was Iraq worth it? And arguing the case that the war was indeed worth it is Dr. James Carafano. He is the Heritage Foundation's Vice President for Foreign and Defense Policy Studies and Director of the Catherine and Shelby Cullom Davis Institute for International Studies. He's also the president of a nonprofit organization, Esprit de Corps, which educates the public about veterans affairs. Dr. Carafano. Now here to my left is Dr. Joseph Collins. He is a professor at the National War College, and he has taught as an adjunct member of the faculty in the graduate divisions of Columbia and Georgetown universities. Before becoming a professor, he served for 3 years as the Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for Stability Operations, the Pentagon's senior civilian official for peacekeeping, humanitarian assistance, and stabilization and reconstruction operations. He will be arguing the point that the war was not worth it. It's probably apropos that we are here gathered to talk about this question tonight because today marks exactly 10 years since Baghdad fell and the toppling of the famous Saddam Hussein statue there in the middle of Baghdad. A decade later, it is common for people to ask the question, was Iraq worth it? Nearly 5,000 U.S. and international troops have been killed because of the war in Iraq, with the majority of that number being American. Tens of thousands of Iraqis were killed in the war. Exact figures are difficult to come by, and they are disputed by various organizations. No weapons of mass destruction were found. U.S. troops have withdrawn, but there is still a lot of violence in Iraq, much of it sectarian between the Sunnis and the Shias. And just in recent days, I'm sure you're all aware, you've heard that al-Qaeda in Iraq has now joined forces with Syrian extremists. So that can basically assure us that there's more violence still to come. So let's start with Dr. Carafano and arguing that the war was worth it.
Well, thank you. First of all, I want to say I'm really honored to be. This is Truth in Advertising. I'm up here with very awesome people. Beverly's been a great voice in Washington, D.C., and Joe is an old friend, a great scholar, and has been a terrific colleague. So I'm just honored to be sitting here with them. As a historian, I feel a special obligation because as a practicer of the historian's craft for over 30 years, I really understand the limitations of looking backwards and drawing lessons of issues and judgment from about thinking about how you think about the future. So mostly what I wanted to say was how much I really thought this is a stupid question and not a very helpful way to look at the issue at all. I would like to just make 3 points and turn it over to Joe. The first is I don't have a dog in this fight. I had nothing to do with the decision to go to war. I wasn't in the administration. I work at a think tank. I wasn't at the think tank when people were deciding these issues. I have been an observer of this process from day one. I think my role is to try to inform people about what happened, what I think it means, but I don't have a record to defend, and I don't really feel like defending anybody else's record. So I'm an observer in this process. The second thing is the way we think about war is not structured to ask the question after the fact. If you looked at just war doctrine, it's very, very clear. The issues of having the right to make the decision to go to war, using the process of proportionality both before, during the conflict as to whether what you're doing is just and proper, but the system intellectually, politically, decision-wise, has never been based to say after the fact, is that the right decision or not? So if you look at World War II, when we finished World War II, 60 million people were dead. Half of the world was controlled by a totalitarian murderous regime. And yet today, much of us look back fondly at World War II. Nobody ever argues it was a bad war, it wasn't worth it. Well, why is that? Well, it's because we kind of were okay with how things finally turned out. We didn't die in a nuclear fireball. The Soviet Union collapsed. And so our assessment is it's okay. And generally, that's the way things work. When you ask the question of was the war worth it, you're actually saying very little about was the war worth it, and you're making a comment on where you are today, how you feel about things today, and you're using the past to really justify your path forward. Which really leads to my third comment, which is I think it's really a mistake to think about war, period, as a separate and isolated phenomenon. And I think in part we do this because this is part of our narrative culture. So we all went to school, we all had a textbook. In the textbook there are chapters. Chapter 3, the Civil War starts. The end of chapter 3, the Civil War ends, and then we move on to peace. So we are very much structured in our thinking and thinking in terms of chapters of history and chapters of war and peace, when the reality is national security is a continuum. There are no perfect answers. Problems never get solved. Every war that solves a problem creates another problem, often winds up being the seed of another war. You don't get to do counterfactuals. You don't get to go back and rerun the war to see what would have happened if we'd done something differently. So I think actually the notion of thinking about discrete periods of war as a separate from the continuum of national security is actually a very unhelpful and dangerous way to think about that. Do we use history to inform our judges? Absolutely. But I think we really have to recognize the limitations of what they can do. And the notion that you can draw a lesson from a past conflict and that is going to instill some special kind of judgment or knowledge or belief to you that's going to allow you to not make stupid, dangerous, wrong, or brilliant decisions in the future, it's just not rational. So as much as I appreciate the debate, as much as I appreciate the question, it's never a question that I would debate.
Dr. Collins.
Wow. I was asked to do this after having expressed the notion that the war in Iraq was the biggest mistake that we made since the sending of American troops to Vietnam. So I sort of signed on the mistake end of the thing, and when I heard James was going to do the opposite, I thought to myself, oh my God, he must feel like he lost the toss. You know? I mean, yeah, arguing in favor of Iraq is very, very difficult, and being the wily strategist that he is, he adopted the technique of nolo contendere. I'm actually arguing very clearly that the war in Iraq was not worth it. One method, the classical one, would assess U.S. goals and then look at the blood and treasure invested, and then bump that up against the outcome, the end state, what happened, what was achieved by our efforts. And of course, we have to have humility here. Although Baghdad is not likely to become Seattle anytime soon, outcomes evolve. After many years, of course, as the outcomes evolve, the war recedes from being a cause and becomes a contextual factor. As far as Iraq is concerned at this point in time, I think we know for sure by looking at a simple cost-benefit analysis that Iraq was a very high-cost operation in terms of people, in terms of money, and and also in terms of political damage to our country. And to date, we've had very, very little returns from it. Let me talk a bit about the motives and objectives. What were we? And I'll use we a lot, and I'm using the royal we here. I mean the United States of America, the U.S. government, Democrats and Republicans, yes, Democrats and Republicans, and a number of friendly governments as well. That's the we here. What were we trying to do by invading Iraq? In the aftermath of 9/11, the war was motivated by the behavior of Saddam, the nature of his regime, his aggressive record, his support for and relationship with international terrorists, and his WMD stockpile, and perhaps more importantly, his WMD research program. There were other supporting motivations. Saddam Hussein, for many Americans, was unfinished business from a war a decade before. Our Air Force was enforcing a no-fly zone, and in the decade between the Gulf Wars, flew 300,000 sorties. 300,000 sorties over about 10 years. That's 30,000 a year. We were flying the wings off the U.S. Air Force to keep Saddam in a box. At the same time, the support internationally for the sanctions against Saddam, they were beginning to falter. Even UN officials were complaining about the alleged inhumanity of the UN-endorsed sanctions. So in OSD policy at the time, and I was in the government for a part of this, and if this was the Napoleonic era, I would be a private in the rear rank of planners in terms of planning Iraq. I was more involved with things in Afghanistan, but I was in fact involved and watching some of this with great puzzlement. In OSD policy, we talked about the motivation to go into Iraq as the 3 T's plus WMD. Saddam was a tyrant. He supported international terrorism. He was a regional threat and had frequently invaded his neighbors. And most importantly, he had used WMD against his neighbors. He had used chemical weapons against his own citizens. And he had, we thought, a huge WMD and illegal missile stockpile, or so the CIA and every intelligence service in the world believed that at the time. More importantly, we believe that he also had an active WMD research program, which included nuclear efforts. After the 9/11 attacks, you didn't have to be paranoid to worry about Saddam Hussein, WMD technology, and terrorists. So our objectives were fairly simple. We were going to depose Saddam Hussein. We were going to clean up the WMD. And then, magically, we were going to rapidly establish a legitimate Iraqi government, a government that would rule decently, be a bulwark against Iran, and be an ally in the war on terrorism. We were propelled in all of this by incorrect intelligence and bad advice from emigres. And I would have to say now, in retrospect, faulty decision-making. We assumed that the war would be hard, and the peace would be easy, and reconstruction would be financed by Iraqi oil revenue. Our plans were predicated on a quick turnover to an interim government and a rapid military withdrawal. It's not clear today that that would even have been humanly possible. We were wrong on many counts. In fact, it would be miraculous if the Iraq War was worth it given that we went there on the basis of bad intelligence and sensitive assumptions. What about the notion that the war in Iraq would be all about democratization and not just in Iraq, but all the way across the Middle East? That rationale really surfaces after we failed to find weapons of mass destruction inside of Iraq. And that's been documented in a number of books. In brief, we did not invade Iraq to spread democracy, although for people who were having to engage in the spin of our prolonged engagement in Iraq, democracy was a word that kept coming up more and more. So much for objectives. Let's turn to costs. And Beverly outlined some of them. We lost 4,500 U.S. servicemen and women, plus 300 allies. We suffered over 32,000 wounded. And this figure of 36,000 casualties killed and wounded only includes a fraction of the hundreds of thousands of now diagnosed cases of traumatic brain injury and post-traumatic stress. Over 110,000 Iraqi civilians died. The upward limit of, I think, responsible estimates is about 125,000. Now, these people did not die at our hands. We didn't kill that many Iraqis, but they died on our watch, certainly. In direct costs, the Congressional Research Service tells us we spent about $900 billion in Iraq in direct war costs. New estimates at Harvard and other places talk about $4 trillion, but if you use their methodology, we're still paying for World War II. And so, the direct war costs are about $1 trillion, and if that's not enough for you, you can go and count what's going to happen 15 or 20 years from now. So, this is all terrible, but the political costs also were quite severe. The war increased Iran's influence in Iraq and the region. The war in Iraq became the first military priority in the war on terrorism. By relentlessly servicing Iraq as the first priority, it damaged our war efforts in Afghanistan, which I would argue was and is a more important use of our military efforts. The Iraq War also set a bad precedent. This was not a preemptive war. It was a preventive war. Such wars are of dubious legality, and they failed the ethical tests for just wars. And that's a critically important standard. When people think you're doing something that's essentially wrong, that's a bad foot to start off on. So, in the future, preventive wars may be necessary, but they certainly pose a special burden for the instigator of such wars. Finally, what was the outcome of our efforts? All of this could be justified, but it hasn't been. The Iraqi government is a mess. It's pushing sectarian violence as a policy. The Iraqi government has failed to maintain order. More civilians died in Iraq last year than in Afghanistan, which actually has a larger population than Iraq. The Iraqi government subverts its own democracy. Prime Minister Maliki has made war in his own coalition, especially the Sunni members of it. Al-Qaeda in Iraq, which was once nearly eliminated, is on the rise again. And Maliki and company have become an adjunct to Iran's meddling in Syria. And finally, sadly, after $1 trillion and 36,000 casualties, the United States has very little leverage over the Maliki government. All that said, the outcome in Iraq could have been worse. In 2006, the ugly and violent war spiraled out of control. To attempt to right the situation and to give the fledgling government in Iraq a chance, President Bush, over the objections of many of his generals and political appointees, decided to surge U.S. forces and to shift to a counterinsurgency posture. This worked. In conjunction with the Sunni awakening, it calmed an escalating conflict, brought many Sunni fighters into the fold, and nearly eliminated al-Qaeda in Iraq. It set the stage also for the maturation of Iraqi forces and created the conditions that allowed for an orderly U.S. withdrawal. The surge was an act of great political courage. It enabled the forces on the ground and the diplomats to do the nearly impossible. They created a decent cloth purse of stability out of a sow's-ear of escalating violence, nearly destroying al-Qaeda in Iraq in the process. Well done, soldiers and diplomats. But the surge did not make the war worth it. It did prevent it from ending in a devastating battlefield defeat. Sadly, after the surge, the Obama administration and the Maliki government were not able to agree on a status of forces agreement. The United States was not able to keep an advisory mission and a large-scale security assistance effort going on after our withdrawal. In the end, after $1 trillion and 36,000 casualties, the United States is left with very little influence in Iraq. Writing in the New York Times last weekend, Professor Kanan Makia, a strong advocate of the invasion and one of the most thoughtful Iraq experts in the world, wrote, "I could not in good conscience tell an American family grieving for a son killed in Iraq that the war was worth it." Considering the source, it's hard to argue with that statement. And I have some other remarks. I'll stop there and we'll go through it. Thank you.
Just for those keeping time, I wanted to go back to you to see if you had any other comments that you would like to add, since you spoke for a shorter amount of time than Dr. Collins.
Oh, just real quickly. First of all, Prime Minister Maliki wrote in the Washington Post, the war was worth it. So I guess they could have dueling op-eds, but that's their problem, not ours. I would, I want to be clear as a historian. It's not that I wouldn't grade how people did, because that is part of the job of the historian, and I would do that. And one of the problems I think with saying is something worth it is if you lump it all together, you may not actually get a kind of a useful, accurate picture. So, for example, if you looked at the Civil War in terms of how it was conducted, you take different pieces, you kind of give them different grades. I think that's true in most wars, certainly true in the Iraq War. So if somebody said, well, what do you think, Jim? Do we really do this right? I would actually segregate the grade into 4 parts. If you said the decision to go to war, I'd give you a C+. We could argue all sides of that. Personally, I wouldn't have done it, but I could make the case. If you look at the post-war occupation period, it's a clear F. It was abysmally planned. And much of what our problem is not with the fact there were no WND. It wasn't with the decision to go to war. It was really the fact of the abysmal spiraling of violence and incredible amounts of money and waste and treasure that we did in the immediate aftermath of the war as the whole thing just spun out of control. That's the thing, honestly, that we're all really angry about. That's an F. The surge is a B. I wouldn't give everything the surge did, a great remark, but they did a lot right and going up a very difficult situation. For me, the part we don't talk about, which is very troubling, is the way we ended, which I would give an F, which I think we've squandered. Really, any advantage we got back from the surge in terms of stability and influence, we have squandered that in the way we left. I think that's it.
Okay. So now that you've heard both sides of whether or not...
1.5 sides.
1.5, but both sides, both opportunities to present a side of whether Iraq was worth it. My question is, what happens now? The U.S. has pulled its troops out, although let's be clear, there are still Americans in Iraq and will be for quite a long time. The civilians, the diplomats, some contractors. So let's not lull ourselves into thinking that because the troops are gone, there are no more Americans in Iraq. That's not the case. We're still there. But what happens now that the active military presence is over, that is no more? What happens? Dr. Collins?
I had a, by then, aging professor who some of you may know the name, William T.R. Fox at Columbia, and he counseled us that whenever we're asked to predict the future, What we have to do is to analyze the past because it's much easier. And he said, if you're forced into doing it, he said, you have to give a presentation in the following format. On the one hand, on the other hand, only time will tell. And I'm not sure I can do any better than that. Potential futures, it's hard to say. And one of the reasons why it's hard to say is because we have relatively little leverage. And Jim mentioned that it ended poorly, and there was supposed to be a bridging period where there would be a large, not very visible, but a large U.S. presence and a large security assistance effort, and our discussions and mentoring and close relationship that we had built up between 2003 and 2011, that relationship would continue to thrive. And that hasn't been the case. And the Maliki government would not allow for a status of forces agreement, which gave our forces immunity from prosecution and in Iraqi courts, which is a very standard thing. And so, we're left with a large embassy compound and an incredibly small security assistance mission, and not very much. So where does that leave Iraq? I think it leaves Iraq pretty much on its own. And some people would say, well, that's a good thing. It's a sovereign state. It should be on its own. And what are the, what can happen? The Maliki government can muddle through, and it will be replaced in a year or so, and it may get better. Of course, it may get worse. The current status quo might devolve into a new Shiite-dominated dictatorship. Third, there could be a soft partition of the country into areas of influence, some controlled by the Kurds, some controlled by Sunnis, and a large part of the country and the government probably controlled by the Shia. Finally, in the distant future, there is a small possibility that Iraq could become a decent, unified, democratic, stable state. And at this point, I should launch into, well, what should the United States do in order to make that come about? But we don't have the kind of leverage that would, I think, be appropriate for that. And so I would say, despite $1 trillion investment and all of those casualties, U.S. policy is not a critical variable in the evolution of the Iraqi government for the future. Sad to say.
Dr. Carafano?
Yeah, well, I think it's very difficult to argue with that. I mean, the U.S. has very little influence. I mean,
I'm glad you guys agree on one thing.
There are no do-overs in history. I mean, if it had ended well, we'd have actually found ourselves in a very interesting position today, because Iran is actually weakened. Their economy's in bad shape. A very strong, powerful Iraq, which is an ally of the United States, if we really had a serious policy of pressing back on Iran, that would put the Iranians in a very difficult place. If we were strong in Iraq and had maintained strong relations with Israel and Turkey, we'd actually be in a very good place in Syria, because we would be strong friends with including the Jordanians, with all the states surrounding Syria. And with Iraq and Iran, we'd actually be ironically, the United States could have been in a very, very powerful position in terms of protecting its interests. Now we've really have, in many ways, our ability to influence events in the region is less than it was when the war started. If there's only one saving grace, it's that I think the Iranian influence is because of the troubles they're having in Syria, and because of the troubles with their own economy and their own domestic politics. The Iranian influence may be lower, but the U.S. influence is lower, so it's kind of a zero-sum game. So We're not in a strong position. We can do very little to influence the future of Iraq, and Iraq has some serious problems. So there are more al-Qaeda this year than were last year. The al-Qaeda and depending on how Syria comes out, that could make things even worse. Potentially, and Iraq is going to be very little help on Syria. They're going to be very little help on Iran because they're going their own way. And the most disappointing is because we left so soon and we didn't keep that leverage, Maliki has turned into really kind of a typical Middle East politician where the purpose of an election is to, once you get elected, is to figure out how you sustain your power forever. It's not to perpetuate a system of further elections. It wasn't so bad with Konrad Adenauer in Germany. That kind of worked out okay. But in most other places where we've gone down that route, it's just led back to an authoritarian regime. And then you've got the Kurds who are still doing, kind of okay, but they're in a tough neighborhood. So, I would be buying stock in the Iraqi Hilton.
Let me follow up before we move on to the next question. I want to ask, is there any way to reestablish U.S. influence or build back some of the leverage that both of you say that we've lost in Iraq?
Yeah, so this is my favorite thing, which is the problem with most strategists and policymakers get wrong. It's the joke about the drunk looking for his keys under the lamp post, and the cop goes, "What are you doing?" He goes, "I'm looking for my keys." The guy goes, "Where's your car?" He goes, "Well, it's parked down the street." And the cop goes, "Well, what are you doing here?" He goes, "Well, the light's better here," right? So the tendency we have is to focus on the problem that we can do very little about, as opposed to focusing on the places where we have leverage and power. So really what the United States should be doing is being in the places where we actually can influence Middle East policy and protect our interests. And that's really with countries like Jordan and Turkey and Israel, where we have some influence that are very important. There's really not much we can do about the Iraqs and the Syrias and the Egypts of the world. And of course, the other thing we could be doing is pressing very hard to keep Iran in a very small box. So the answer on Iraq is, not much.
Dr. Collins?
I would have to agree that we should focus on Jordan and Turkey and Israel, and that there's not much that we can do. When there is a changeover in government, we can see if we can't get them back to the table and talk about this issue of a status of forces agreement so that we could have a more robust security assistance effort. However, in the meantime, in the United States, there's probably very little appetite right now for, making a stronger security assistance effort in Iraq. And so I'm sort of at loggerheads. We need to, keep up our diplomatic presence. We need to keep pushing, and we need to keep working with all the nations in the region to help us help them vis-a-vis Iraq. Of course, the problem there is most of our friends in that part of the world are Sunni, and this is a Shia government bent on becoming more and more of a Shia government and less of a democratic coalition. So awfully difficult situation.
So essentially what I hear you both saying is that, for lack of a better way to phrase it, the U.S. is kind of a lost cause in terms of having influence, real influence, in Iraq now, so it needs to focus on the countries in the region that it can influence.
I mean,
is that an accurate assessment?
Fair. I mean, we're really boxing ourselves out of a lot of things. I mean, if you look, if you look at the where we're going forward in defense spending, just maintaining core capabilities is going to be very, very difficult. And so, for example, there are missions that are already before the effects of sequester have hit, which are falling off the table. So we're just not doing counter narcotics in Latin America anymore, right? we just stopped pretty much. It would be almost not only, it's not just a question of political will, but to muster the resources to go back in and do significant training missions. They're going to be making decisions about what are you not going to do, and those are going to be very, very hard sells. So this administration has really closed off its strategic options as opposed to widening in the last 4 years. They have less options on what to do than they did 4 years ago, and the way they're going to have less options 4 years from now.
if I can be wildly optimistic, just for 30 seconds, the next government may want a greater security assistance effort. And the rose among the thorns there is the fact that Iraq is capable of paying cash. If they want military equipment, they want training, they want advice and assistance, they're capable of paying. And so, that may be a minor benefit along the way. In all of these relationships, there's always a sense that one party wants to see how much the other one wants to improve the relationship, and then if they sense that there is an asymmetry, then they're going to, rather than paying for the equipment, they may say, well, can you give it to us, at a discount, or could you even transfer it to us, for nothing? But a new government a year or two from now in Iraq may present other opportunities. And this is the sort of thing, like the old Bismarck, the famous Bismarck quotation that the statesman's job is to listen for the footsteps of the Almighty, and then when he passes overhead to reach up and grab the hem of his garment. There may be opportunities that come that change all of this, but for right now, there's not much leverage.
Can I be an optimist now?
Sure.
All right, so look, so, for example, okay, Iraq's bad and we're losing influence. But look at Egypt. Egypt's not in a good situation as a future U.S. ally. I think it's a very much an open question if Egypt remains stable or if it remains pro-U.S. And there are different scenarios we might see, but one of them might be an Egyptian government that doesn't like U.S. military ships transiting the Suez Canal anymore, and maybe abrogates the peace treaty with Israel, and maybe has an independent foreign policy that's kind of anti-American. Well, you know what? That's not the first time that's ever happened. It kind of happened in the 60s, and it was kind of that way for a long time, that Egypt wasn't, a constructive country for us. So, anybody that measures foreign policy is that unless good things happen and continue to happen, you don't have a good foreign policy. That just doesn't understand the nature of international relations and national security. These things are competition. For every good thing you do, there's a bad guy out there trying to do something bad. And for every step you take, there's somebody trying to figure out how to screw it up and take advantage of every mistake you've ever made or overcome any advantage you've ever gained. So there is this kind of continuum. And if there's one mistake, it's to take the present and make it a linear projection of the future and assume that that's the only course. Jonas, when I went back and taught at West Point in the 80s, at the very first 10 minutes of the Reagan era, I remember we had a conference. It was supposed to be on the Vietnam War, and the conference devolved into the theme, is this the end of America? I mean, everybody, there was literally about America becoming a second-class power. So this is exactly like 3 years before we rebuild the military, and then, within a decade, the Soviet Union collapsed, and we're all running around in 1991 saying, well, there are no enemies, America's unchallenged, we're going to be the world superpower forever, we're going to have the world, and nothing's ever going to happen. So, we always make this mistake as we look at where we are right now, and we look at the situation we have right now, and we have to remember we are an actor, and we have agency. And we made choices, we made bad choices, which maybe got us here. That doesn't preclude us making good choices to get us to a better place.
Before we move on to the next part of the program, just really, really quickly, we've kind of talked about it and around it, but the role of Iran in Syria, in Iraq, is there any? Both of you, I think I can answer this for you. You both think that that the U.S. has no influence in terms of keeping Iran and Syria from dominating Iraqi politics. But
well, I guess the good news is the Iranians and the Syrians kind of have their own problem right now. So dominating Iraq is right now kind of the least of their problems.
And Mr. Maliki has found out that the tribes that live along the border, many of which are Sunni tribes, are taking matters into their own hands. And they're not permitting their territory to be used for the transit of fighters or materiel on the ground. So the Iranians have been sort of, being kept to the air. We don't have much influence over that. We've continued to talk to the Iraqis about it. And I think the Iraqis are probably, I don't know this for sure, I think they're probably telling us they don't have
Right.
much influence, and they don't have many levers over the Iranians. That said, the situation in Syria is absolutely ripe right now, at this point in time, for delivering a tremendous defeat to Iran, because Syria is one of Iran's great allies, and it's going down. And there is a relationship between, and I'm not a theologian, so I can't explain it, but there's a close relationship between the Alawites who rule in Syria and the Shia who rule in Iran. And they're both going down in a very big way. And by standing back, that's, one of the things we're not being able to influence at this point in time. And I realize the appetite for another major military or intelligence operation in that part of the world is very, very low. But, there are, inside of, that challenging situation, there are some opportunities. And one of them is to deliver a defeat to the Iranians. And this is also, when the Syrian regime falls, it will also be have tremendous benefits for Lebanon. And so there are, inside this cauldron in Syria, there are tremendous opportunities for peace and stability in the region, and for delivering a defeat for the Iranians and also for the Syrians.
Yeah, that's the optimist, right?
Yeah,
Because
yeah,
we don't know
yeah,
the problem is
yeah.
if we knew what Syria was going to look like when it's all
Yeah.
said and done, and that's the only outcomes, then that would be all right.
Yeah, that's the problem with the entire, Arab Spring. I think it's a tremendously big assumption to believe that these new Arab governments, maybe less, are going to, this situation is going to be more favorable to the United States and more favorable to democracy. It's quite possible that there will be new governments. They will be very different, and they may be less friendly to the United States. They may even be less efficient than their predecessors, and they may even be less democratic in the long run. And I absolutely pray that, I'm wrong about that. We all hope, of course, that the arc of history bends towards modernization, justice, and human rights. But in the Middle East, not so much. Not so much. It's a bad situation. The Arab Spring was caused by the Arab Winter. The Arab Winter, goes all the way back, more than a millennium. These people have lived under bad governments. They ran bad economies. They were inefficient. They were corrupt. And that was the cause of the Arab Spring. What comes next? It's not coming out of the same playbook as the American Revolution and the revolutions that took place in Europe.
All right. Dr. Collins, thank you for your summation there. Dr. Carafano?
I don't know why any student of the French Revolution would be, shocked or surprised at what's going on in the Arab Spring. Joe actually hit on a very good point, which is the discussion or the element of foreign policy that has simply been completely ignored, which is fundamentally in many of the countries in this part of the world, the fundamental issue is economic freedom. And if you don't have property rights, if you have high levels of corruption, if you have chronic unemployment, very poor education, there are no economic opportunities, it's very difficult to see how you get out of the cycle of exploitation that we had. For me, the most unfortunate thing so far in Egypt in the Arab Spring is a government has come to power, forget about what you think about them politically, but seemingly incapable and disinterested in dealing with the issues of economic freedom, which just leads me to believe that either this is going to become a very repressive totalitarian society, or the revolution in this part of the world is just not over.
We've covered a lot of ground here this evening, and the one overarching message I think that comes to me, and we're going to open it up and let the audience ask some questions, but the overarching message that comes clear to me is that you cannot simply talk about any one country in this region without exploring the entire region and the underlying issues and problems that ultimately have us where we are today. I think that's the overriding message that's clearly come through here. Now, you all have been waiting patiently, and you have lots of questions, so I would ask that you queue at the microphone.
I believe there were a number of people who felt that the run-up to the war in Iraq was a one-sided rush. It was pushed relentlessly by one side of the debate. The other side of the debate got very little airtime, in fact was excluded from the debate. People like Scott Ritter, for example, who had been a weapons inspector in Iraq, who came forth categorically stating that there was no such program, or that there was a program, but there weren't the stockpiles. So I don't think we had an honest, open debate going into the war, which is why Senator Byrd stood on the Senate floor and said, slow down. So the lesson learned, perhaps, is to engage the people in an open and honest debate about the most important thing we do as a nation, which is to go to war.
I agree with that 100%. I will say that there were a lot of people who were rushing to judgment. They weren't just in the administration. They also were in the Senate and in the House. And those people, both Democrats and Republicans, were reading the same intelligence that the Bush administration was doing. Senator Byrd, I remember his principled stand. Senator Byrd, I think, was almost completely isolated on that particular issue. And again, Scott Ritter didn't have a Mormon Tabernacle choir of arms inspectors behind him either. He also was a lone voice crying in the wilderness. Was it a rush to judgment? The people who were rushing to judgment said, hey, listen, we've been doing this for 10 years now. We've already had 17 UN resolutions about Saddam Hussein. When is this going to, move to fruition? When are we going to resolve this? And Saddam's deception, which, by the way, has been documented tremendously by the Institute for Defense Analysis, based on documents from translated documents from Iraq, and also interviews with hundreds of Iraqi national security officials. Saddam's deception was so good, his own generals believed that their division didn't have nuclear weapons, but the Republican guards around the bend, they probably did. And so it was an incredibly intricate bit of deception, which helped us to make the mistakes that we did.
So here's where I would agree with you, which is, and this is ironic because people often think of military people as being militaristic, and actually the opposite is true. I was in the Army for 25 years, and I actually thought wars were abhorrent because we actually knew the cost and pain of it. And military people are usually the one going, dude, stand back. Matter of fact, we have three former military academy graduates at the Heritage Foundation, and when we're often having discussions about the use of force, we are often the most pacifist guy in the room, and we're going, think about this, right? You should never make the decision to go to war lightly, and the reason for that was said by Thucydides, who wrote about war long before any of us, and what he said is as relevant today as when he wrote it, and what he said will absolutely never change in the history of the human race, and that is war is a step off into the dark. That once you embark on war, you never can really tell where this thing is going. Everybody thinks the war is going to be over by Christmas. Everybody thinks it's going to be short and sweet. Nobody thinks, unless you're, Mao Zedong or, Saddam or Osama bin Laden, I'm signing up for a 100-year struggle. You don't really know what's going to happen. And that's why we've kind of blown past just war tradition or just war theory, whatever you want to call it, because it's actually a very thoughtful framework. It doesn't promise you that you're not going to make mistakes, you're not going to make wrong answers. It does say you have to have kind of a thoughtful conversation beforehand, and at least you may not have the facts right, be true and honest about what you're doing. And I think that is very important. But the notion that somehow if we just had more debate and discussion, we would have got to a different place, that's never really likely to happen. Scott seems very profound after the fact that we know what was there. At the time, he was just one of lots of people who had an opinion. And, everybody gets to be right once. It's like the infinite number of monkeys typing on an infinite number of typewriters. One of them is going to come out with a smart thing to say, right? Even if he was, who's the guy that predicts everything? What's his name?
Nostradamus.
No. The election guy, Nathan. What's his name?
Oh, Nate Silver.
It's Nate Silver, who I'm a big fan of. Nate Silver, brilliant guy. He's right 9 times out. Someday Nate Silver's going to predict wrong, right? Well, that one wrong time could be in a war in which there are millions and thousands of casualties, right? So, this notion that somehow we can be wise in our choices to use force, the reality is they may well be imperfect, and there is no going back. Even if you made one, and this was, I think, the discussion that was, for me, very frustrating in 2005, as people were saying, we shouldn't have gone to war. It's like the guy in the Alamo going, we shouldn't have started this.
The topic we're addressing right now, of course, was Iraq worth it? And it assumes, I would think, that bad planning and bad implementation was inevitable. Now, you bring up the other possibility. If we'd have done it, the planning well and the implementation well, would it have then been worth it? And then this brings up Dr. Carafano's point. You were suggesting that we should have left immediately after the defeat of the Iraqi army. This, of course, was the original intention of Secretary Rumsfeld. Was Secretary Rumsfeld right?
Of course, if we had done the planning better, we might have sort of penetrated into some of the weaknesses in the WMD case. That's quite possible. If we had done it well, if we had executed, first off, the beginning of the war went terrifically. The war was better, easier, and faster than we thought it was going to be. And there was no use of WMD. People forget now that our forces went throughout the war wearing their charcoal chemical suits because they thought when they got close enough to Baghdad, at the very least, they were going to encounter chemical weapons. So that part of the war went swimmingly well. What didn't go swimmingly well was the assumption that we could hand over things very, very quickly. And when that turned out not to have been able to come about very, very quickly with very little planning and very little consultation, the president changed horses. And he said, okay, we are now going to, we're not going to turn over, we're now going to occupy Iraq. Jerry Bremer apparently wanted to do it for 2 years. It was decided back here that it would only be for 1, that we were going to occupy Iraq, and that we were in effect going to govern the country because the Iraqis weren't ready to come forward and govern themselves. Still, lots of arguments about the people who were in high positions back at that point in time, whether or not that was possible. Frankly, my best guess, and it is a guess, is that that was not possible, and that had we war-gamed that with a better understanding of Iraq, the Iraqi mindset, and conditions on the ground, and the deleterious effects of living for so long under Saddam Hussein, we would have realized that that would have been impossible. We did not have that understanding.
So historians aren't supposed to do this, but I'll do it anyway, which is what would have happened if. So I think our real problem with the war is not the war, the invasion, or not finding WD. It's with the occupation period, which was the bloody spiral of violence. If I could go back, if the war had ended well and we had left and nobody had found WMD, then we'd be on our 4th Bush presidency. Nobody would have cared that there was no WMD. What the no WMD did was it gave people a get out of jail free card who were for the war, because they say, oh, you lied to me, so now that things are bad, I can run away and hate you, right? Because I'm not responsible anymore. Alternatively, I think we could have found mountains of WMD, and if we still gone through a bloody, horrible, terrible occupation, people still would have turned against the war. That's where and here's maybe where Joe and I differ a little, and Joe is on the inside, so maybe he knows better than I do. I don't necessarily blame the administration for getting in the country and finding out that all their assumptions on the post-occupation period were totally screwed up and wrong, because they were absolutely, totally baloney, and they were useless. I blame them for not having a plan B to deal with that, and not adjusting and taking so long to really realize the reality of what's going on around, acknowledge that, and adjust to that. Now, I'm not really necessarily that hard on them for not having a good plan for the occupation, because remember, and we're going to see the same thing in North Korea when it collapses. These are totalitarian societies where information is tightly controlled and very manipulated, and you don't know the reality of what's going on the ground. So the notion is we should have planned better for the occupation. Well, yeah, if we were going to invade Luxembourg, but we're invading a country which we didn't even know the state. And then, of course, afterwards, we're always going to find somebody who say, well, I knew exactly what was going to happen. Well, okay, maybe you did, but how do we know that you did, right? So the reality is you should go into these occupations, and there's not a great film, it's actually pretty mediocre, but The Emperor, this film on the occupation of post-war Japan is pretty interesting. We go into post-war Japan, and let's be honest, we have very limited capacity to know what the situation is going to be like on the ground and how those people are going to respond. We went into the occupation of Germany after World War II. The prediction was hundreds of thousands of sleeper agents would be fighting. We would be fighting a guerrilla warfare in there for 2 years. Not only did we believe that, the Germans believed that. The reality was that we had about 12 werewolf attacks. Somebody painted a swastika, and then they ran and hid in the chalet, and it just evaporated. Well, I don't even think the Germans knew how quickly they were going to lose their fight. But you don't know until you get to that period. So it is this kind of great step into the unknown. But we did totally screw up once we discovered that our plan was totally bananas. And Joe taught me this: no plan survives contact with the enemy, or contact with the occupation. Instead of very quickly and rapidly adjusting, we really kind of screwed things up for 2 or 3 years.
Well, Dr. Carafano and Dr. Collins, thank you very much for your comments. Thank you for joining us for World Affairs Today, a production of the World Affairs Council, Washington, D.C. Stay connected with us at www.worldaffairstoday.org.